各位，当日本军队踏入中国土地的时候，世界并没有站出来，没有联合声明，没有军事的援助，甚至没有象征性的谴责。南京发生的事情后来被称为20世纪最为惨烈的大屠杀之一，却长期被排除在西方主流记忆之外。在欧洲与北美的历史书写中，第二次世界大战通常从珍珠港或者波兰开始，犹太人大屠杀被反复的讲述，而南京往往只剩下最后一行注脚，甚至完全消失。但在中国社会内部，这一种记忆从未被遗忘，它并不是抽象的历史，而是家族与城市共同承受过的现实。当二战被反复讲述为一场欧洲的胜利时，另一个起点却被系统性的压低了音量。亚伦、巴斯塔尼作为英国政治经济评论者，在讨论21世纪秩序崩塌的时候，反复触及一个被忽略的事实：真正最早被全面卷入战争的并不是欧洲。当历史的叙事被压缩成单一战线，一场规模巨大、代价极高的战争就被留在了阴影里面。这正是今天重新回到现实的核心矛盾。在过去一段时间，围绕二战记忆的讨论再次升起，从教材、纪念方式到国际政治话语，争论不断。在西方主流叙事中，战争往往从欧洲全面爆发讲起，强调轴心国与同盟国的对抗逻辑。而在中国的视觉下，战争的时间线被明显的拉长，它更像是一场持续多年的生存抗争。而生活中，人们或许只是在纪念日看到零散的片段，却很少意识到这些记忆如何影响当下国家的心理和结构的判断。而真正的断裂在于，二战并非是一场单线的战争，而是多条战线同时展开的结构性冲突。而亚洲战场并不是附属的章节，而是长期牵制、消耗与抵抗的核心组成部分。而西方叙事强调工业动员和军事的决战，中国的经验强调的是长期承受能力、社会组织和政治动员的持续性。正是这一种差异，使得亚洲战争在胜负计算中被低估，也使得中国的角色长期被边缘化。而中西之间的结构对比，不在于道德的宣示，而是在于谁能承受了时间与消耗的压力。这一种压力最终改变了全球力量的走向。当今天的国际秩序再次出现裂缝，这一段被忽略的历史重新显现出解释力。中国的结构性耐受能力，并非是突然出现，而是源于长期冲突中形成的社会与政治组织的经验。而下一步真正值得追问的，不是历史是否被重新书写，而是谁有能力决定哪一些记忆进入公共的叙事。理解这一点正是嘉宾讨论的关键入口。让我们看一下视频。
The Western Europeans in the United States didn't lift a finger to defend China when it was occupied by the Japanese. Not a finger. And one of the largest massacres of the Second World War, of course, we know the Judeo-side, but very few people know about what happened in Nanjing. A totally horrific massacre for which the Japanese have never apologized, never paid reparations, and sometimes go and pray with Japanese political leaders at the graves of those who led that massacre. So this part of history is now becoming very important again, as we see, given the world we live in, the big rise of China. But it really does, in China, it's still remembered what happened at Nanjing, and the fact that it's hardly ever mentioned. If you look at all the big histories of the Second World War, written by British, French, US historians, Nanjing hardly merits a paragraph, if that. The Americans give it a few pages in their books because it concerns Japan, which attacked them at Pearl Harbor. But here in Europe, it's barely talked about and not known. It's a very one-sided education that we get about the Second World War. I think the way to teach the Second World War is really to argue that there were three different wars taking place. One was the war being waged by the Japanese against China, where the Second World War actually started.
Which is 37 or?
Yeah. And that's where it started and then began to develop. So there's the Japanese-Chinese conflict, and then the Japanese defeat of the British Army at Singapore, an army that Churchill said could never be defeated, smashed into the ground by the Japanese, and that triggered a wave of nationalist rebellions, as you put it. And it's true. All these leaders, most of them, said, on the nationalists basically function on the basis of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They don't think about too much else besides. And that was even more prominent in those days. So the Japanese were initially popular till they began to behave extremely, never in China, but in other countries which they took, Singapore, Malaysia, Burma. People said they've defeated the Brits. There's an uprising in Iraq as well. The Iraqi nationalists in 1942 took power because of what was happening in other parts of the world, and especially after the fall of Singapore, which is a major event in the history of the Second World War, barely taught. And this is a history I've always felt should be taught. And today, they're even beginning to write out the Soviet Union with the way in which history is sort of discussed in globules, not accepting or knowing perfectly well, but not fully understanding that had it not been for the two big triumphs of the Red Army in Stalingrad and Kursk, Hitler would have triumphed. He'd have taken Europe. There would have been European unity under fascism. That we were getting quite close to. One of the few politicians who does mention this, it has to be said, is Michael Heseltine, one of the few from that old generation who remember the war. Most Labour people don't talk about it, and they should, because people should be educated that war was won by a united effort that obviously included Britain, later the United States. But the Soviet role was absolutely central to the victory in Europe, and the Chinese resistance, especially the Chinese communist resistance against the Japanese, played a major role in helping to defeat Japan. So these are things which should be taught. There's no single history of the Second World War. By the way, I know Peter Hitchens well, and often we agree. Despite differences on many other things, often we agree on world politics or various other things as well. It always surprises people, but we do. This is where I think, actually, that the role of the alternative media, the social networks, etc., is quite important. Like we do it, or you do it in particular in Novara, but others do, providing a different take on what's going on in the world. That can be done and should be done on history. I mean, what would have happened if there hadn't been a Stalin-Hitler pact? What would have happened had the appeasers in Britain succeeded and caved into Hitler, which they wanted to do to defeat the Soviet Union? I mean, a bulk of the British ruling class would have been delighted if Hitler had smashed the Russians first before turning to them. But had he done that, he wouldn't have turned to them. They'd have capitulated, and, the Duke of Windsor would have been made King of England once again. So these are things that people don't know about, and history is very controlled now. Often you come across sort of journalists who've been working in mainstream journalism and who haven't been well educated at school, and they haven't a clue. Much, much worse than it was before. I mean, in the 60s, 70s, even the 80s, you had a layer of people working in mainstream television who one didn't agree with, but who were incredibly knowledgeable and certainly understood and knew their history. Now it's, they're given globules. Do this, don't do that, cancel this, don't ask why on television anymore because it confuses people, because he or she tells the truth. This never happened on this scale before. And, when senior journalists were interviewing lots of people from the left, there was a mutual respect, saying, okay, we don't agree with each other, but let's have some degree of honesty and integrity in the way in which arguments are conducted. That has gone. And it's not just here, it's a pattern, a European and North American pattern. And Australia. It's afflicted all the media networks in these countries. And when I used to talk to senior BBC people, they used to say Labour is worse than the Tories, that we were constantly under pressure from Alistair Campbell and the Blair government. Why is your audience filled? I mean, Greg Dyke, then boss of Director General, said to me, I once got a call from Downing Street. The last two question times have been packed with anti-war people. And Greg said, look, it's very difficult for us to find people, honestly, who are pro-war. And they said, no problem. The next time I went on question time, the place was packed by Kurds hired by the Foreign Office and Chatham House, who I said, my God, this is a strange audience. And someone later whispered in my ear, that's why. Is that, we all moan, I do it too. I'm not excusing myself about the mainstream media. But sometimes when people get carried away and go over the top, blaming everything on it, I said, well, in that case, answer me one question. If it is the media that is doing it, how come that 70% of Britons are opposed to what's happening in Gaza? How do you explain that? So this then poses some... So I said, the media plays its role. We know that. But to exclusively blame it is slightly puerile, really. It's the politicians who are not trusted at all, and people don't believe they're politicians. They believe that politicians tell lies non-stop. And so this hostility to traditional politics is something that feeds anger, and so people ignore the media. They don't even hate it. They don't believe it because they're just doing what the politicians tell them to do. So it's an argument that still goes on. But the other thing is that there's no doubt the internet has made a huge difference, and there's no doubt that television networks abroad, like Al Jazeera, have made a huge difference. I mean, just to get different images, one just switches onto Al Jazeera. Even though it's been brought under control a bit, it's still there. I remember once I was in Qatar giving a set of lectures at the university several years ago during the Iraq War. And they said, what do you want to do tomorrow? I said, can I go and see the gang at Al Jazeera who've interviewed me often, but I would like to meet them. So I went in, saw them, and I was talking to the head of the station, who was a Palestinian, it so happens, and very, very good guy. And I said, do you get any interference from the government? He said, no, there's agreement. We don't talk about Qatari politics. We talk about the war, and it works out for us. I said, no, it certainly does. It's very good. But he said, hang on, if you want to know whether we get interference, we do. But it's from the American garrison embedded in the Al Hudayd base, the largest military base in the Middle East. So someone sitting next to him said, tell him the story. He said, okay. We had got footage from Baghdad, from our team, which showed, and we got the tapes as well, finally, Air Force helicopter pilots, US Marines in helicopters, sighting a car which had a father and a mother in the front and two children at the back. Obviously, a family out for whatever. And just for the heck of it, they bombed it, killing them. We'd filmed it all. And so naturally, when the film came in that night, we decided that this was going to lead our news programs the next day. So he said we led with it the early program, led with it on the afternoon program before the 6 o'clock news. He said our security guards came running in and said, we want to warn you that the American army is on the way. And he said a whole number of US jeeps and soldiers, packed with soldiers, with a general sitting in the front, came in, and the general walked into my office without any courtesies. I said, hello. He said, what the hell are you doing showing these images every hour and on the hour? So he said, they're not made up. He said, we know that. You filmed them there. God knows how, but you got the film. Is there another? So he said, isn't this important? Your soldiers basically shooting and killing innocents in cold blood. Isn't that important? News? If one of your news people had it, might a few of them not be tempted to show it as they did in olden times? He said, put a stop to it now. And very threatening noises, and walked out. So he said this happens, not all that regularly, but we are aware of this malign presence in our country which interferes in that fashion.